In 2019, the Washington Post published an article about labor practices in the chocolate supply chain for companies like Hershey, Nestle, and Mars. And what they found was that young children were working long hours under grueling conditions for very little pay. In some cases, the children were told they'd be educated, but instead of receiving an education, they were just working in like chocolate supply chains. And in the words of one farmer, I admit that it is a kind of slavery, but they bring them here to work and it's the boss who takes the money. One of the most important motivations for the stakeholder theory is cases like this. It's wrong for companies to go out and make a huge profit while externalizing the true cost of doing business onto young children. Their interests matter too, and companies should be governed with their interests in mind as well. Stakeholder theories say that the purpose of a corporation is to maximize value for all stakeholders. In a stakeholder theory of the modern corporation, Freeman focuses on only those stakeholders who are vital to the success of a corporation. These include owners, suppliers, management, employees, the local community, and customers. Now, one question you might ask is which stakeholder group is the most important? And according to Freeman, that's the wrong question, because the goal isn't to try to pick one stakeholder group and say this is the important one and their interests outweigh all the others. It's more of a balancing act, where managers in a corporation are supposed to figure out how to balance the competing interests of different stakeholders. When wages are too high and product quality is too low, customers leave, suppliers suffer, and owners sell their stocks and bonds, depressing the stock price and making it difficult to raise new capital at favorable rates. Note, however, that the reason for paying returns to owners is not that they own the firm, but that their support is necessary for the survival of the firm, and that they have a legitimate claim on the firm. Similar reasoning applies in turn to each stakeholder group. According to Freeman, there are many different possible stakeholder theories. Each of them starts with something called a normative core, which is a set of sentences that include things like the following. Corporations ought to be governed, fill in the blank. Managers ought to act to, fill in the blank. For example, a feminist standpoint theory might generate a normative core with the following answers to those questions. Corporations ought to be governed in accordance with the principles of caring, connection, and relationships. Managers ought to act to maintain and care for relationships and networks of stakeholders. You might have another normative core based on ecological principles. Corporations ought to be governed in accordance with the principle of caring for the earth. Managers ought to act to care for the earth. Freeman's normative core comes from something called the doctrine of fair contracts, and it goes something like this. Imagine that you are a self-interested, rational stakeholder of a corporation. What you know is that businesses sometimes involve risks. You know that they can make money. You know about the ways that businesses sometimes affect people in the surrounding environment. You know about different labor practices. You know a whole lot of facts about businesses, but you don't know what your role is. You don't know which kind of stakeholder you're going to be. You might end up being a manager. You might end up being a shareholder. You might end up being an employee or a supplier or somebody who lives in the local community or somebody else. And the question is, under those conditions of ignorance, what rules would you pick? What rules should you pick in order to do the most to advance your own rational best interests, not knowing what kind of stakeholder you're actually going to be? And according to Freeman, there are 6 principles that you would choose. So the first principle is the principle of entry and exit. So any contract in the corporation needs to have clearly defined entry, exit, and renegotiation conditions or method. So the first principle is the principle of entry and exit. Any contract that in the corporation is going to need to have clearly defined entry, exit, and renegotiation conditions, or at least it must have methods or processes for so defining those conditions. Now, this makes sense. It seems like it's going to be important that no matter who you are, you're going to have methods of determining whether or not you're in an agreement and whether or not you're still in it and how to modify it. Second principle is the principle of governance, and it says that the procedure for changing the rules of the game must be agreed upon by unanimous consent. This also makes sense. If you're in the if you're a stakeholder in this community, you don't want all of a sudden the rules about how pollution is going to happen to be changed without your input if you're a member of the local community, right? So that makes sense as well. Third ground rule is called the principle of externalities. And it says that if a contract between A and B imposes a cost on C, then C has the option to become a party to the contract and the terms are renegotiated. And this also makes sense. You don't want to become some third party that gets affected by some contract made by other individuals with no say in those terms. Right? The first principle is the principle of contracting costs, and it says that all parties to the contract must share in the cost of contracting, and that makes sense as well for obvious reasons. The fifth ground rule is the agency principle. It says that any agent has to serve the interests of all stakeholders and must adjudicate conflicts within the bounds of the other principles. And that also makes sense. If you have a corporate executive who is only looking out for the interests of the shareholders or only looking out for the interests of the suppliers, that's going to be a problem if you're a member of one of these other stakeholder groups. So you'd want to vote for a principle like this principle of agency. And the sixth principle is the principle of limited immortality. It says that the corporation shall be managed as if it can continue to serve the interests of stakeholders through time. Stakeholders are uncertain about the future, but subject to exit conditions, they realize that the continued existence of the corporation is in their interest. Therefore, it would be rational to hire managers who are fiduciaries to their interest and the interest of the collective. If it turns out that the collective interest is the empty set, then this principle simply collapses into the agency principle. Now, this rule is also pretty clear. If you are a stakeholder in the organization, you want to make sure that the organization will continue to serve your interests over time. You don't want it to be the sort of thing where it serves your interests for a little bit and then all of a sudden the next day it doesn't do that anymore. So that in a nutshell is Freeman's stakeholder theory. What I'd like to invite you to do is to come up with your own stakeholder theory by starting with a different normative core. So for example, you could start with a Kantian or a utilitarian core framework and then use that to generate a normative core of a stakeholder theory and then see how it works. So good luck. Have a nice day.